Good evening, Council. I am Joe Pearson, Planning and Environmental Services Manager with the City of Oxnard, and I'm here with Contract Planner Heather Davis. This evening, we are giving a presentation on the zoning code amendments to implement the adopted 2021 to 2029 housing element. The zoning code is made up of Chapter 16 of the Oxnard City Code, which is abbreviated OCC in this presentation, and the Oxnard Development Code. The application was filed by the City of Oxnard Community Development Department. In October 2022, the City of Oxnard's sixth cycle 2021 to 2029 housing element was adopted by the City Council and certified by the State of California Department of Housing and Community Development, also known as HCD. The programs identified in the city's housing element established the city's commitment to strategies to meet housing needs and comply with state housing law. Housing element programs 6, zoning code amendments, 9, farm worker housing, 22, special needs groups, 27, parking standards, and 32, Senate Bill 35, identified several zoning code amendments that are necessary to bring the city's zoning code into compliance with recently adopted state housing laws and address identified constraints to residential development. The proposed zoning code amendments will implement the programs identified in the city's housing element for fiscal year 2022 to 2023. Because the amendments are required to comply with state law or involve minor revisions, they are considered minor in nature. The zoning code amendments that are called for in the identified housing element programs are summarized over the next 2 slides. A matrix summarizing all of the proposed code amendments is provided in attachment 1 to the City Council staff report. Housing element program 6 identifies the majority of the required zoning code amendments. These include updates to comply with current state laws, such as current state accessory dwelling unit law to allow garage conversions without the replacement of off-street parking, an update to state guidelines on impact fees for ADUs greater than 750 square feet, substantial changes to state density bonus law, including an increase in the allowable density bonus up to 50%, an increase in the number of incentives to 4, reductions in the affordability requirements for incentives, reduction waiver of parking requirements under certain circumstances, and the removal of common interest requirements for for-sale developments. It also includes recent updates to state law, also required code amendments to limit emergency shelter standards to only those permitted by state law, to allow supportive housing without discretionary review in areas where multifamily and mixed-use developments are permitted, to allow low barrier navigation centers without discretionary review in non-residential zones where mixed use and multifamily are permitted. The state also requires jurisdictions to allow single room occupancy in at least one zoning district. To accommodate this use, this amendment also includes objective standards specific to single room occupancy, such as smaller unit sizes, shared restroom and cooking facilities, and reduced parking. Another update to state law requires jurisdictions to allow residential care facilities in all zones where multifamily is permitted and subject only to those restrictions that apply to other residential dwellings of the same type in the same zone. Consistent with the Fair Housing Amendment Act, subjective findings must be removed from reasonable accommodation findings. And Program 6 also calls for streamlining ordinance provisions, simplifying code requirements, and evaluating potential barriers to construction of affordable housing. Continuing on, the Housing Element Program 9 calls for updates to where farm worker housing is permitted to comply with the Employee Housing Act. Program 27 calls for updates to parking for residential care facilities and repeats the required revision regarding ADU parking mentioned under Program 6. Program 32 calls for objective design standards, which are standards that involve no personal or subjective judgment by a public official and is uniformly verifiable by reference to an external and uniform benchmark. As required under Senate Bill 330, also known as the Housing Crisis Act of 2019, cities or counties are prohibited from imposing new subjective design standards on housing developments where housing is an allowable use. On September 7th, the Planning Commission reviewed the proposed zoning text amendments and recommended that the City Council approve the amendments to Chapter 16 of the Oxnard City Code and the Downtown Code with 4 recommended changes. These changes include minor revisions to the special requirements and the density bonus ordinance, and revisions to the proposed single-room occupancy, on-site management, and parking requirements, as well as the existing group quarter parking requirements. This presentation focuses on the 4 changes that were recommended by the Planning Commission at their hearing. And now at this time, I'll turn the mic over to Heather Davis, who will go over the 4 revisions to the zoning code amendments that were recommended by the Planning Commission.
Thank you, Joe. Good evening, Council. Based on public input submitted prior to the Planning Commission hearing, staff compiled a matrix of 5 recommended minor revisions that provide clarity and correction to existing and proposed Oxnard City Code text regarding special requirements, density bonus, and design review. The Planning Commission recommended the revisions be implemented into the zoning text amendment. The ordinance reflects the minor revisions. Next slide, please. A single-room occupancy is a form of permanent, affordable rental housing made up of small, often furnished single rooms where tenants usually share a kitchen, bathroom, and laundry. Single-room occupancy provides a valuable form of affordable private housing for individuals and can serve as an entry point into the housing market for extremely low-income population, including formerly homeless persons, seniors, and those with disabilities. To accommodate single-room occupancy development, the proposed zoning text amendment includes a new division in the zoning code specifically for development and operation of single-room occupancy. The objective development standards for single-room occupancy will be in place of the multifamily attached unit development standards and are intended to reduce development costs to accommodate this type of development, including reduced unit size, reduced parking, and no requirements for balconies, storage, exterior open space, and other requirements. A public comment submitted before the Planning Commission hearing identified a concern with the requirement for 24-hour on-site management, which they stated could be cost prohibitive for smaller single-room occupancy development. Many communities establish a threshold of between 7 and 12 units before requiring on-site management. Due to the communal nature of single-room occupancy housing with shared kitchens, bathrooms, and common room areas, management access is an important factor in the success of a single-room occupancy development. The Planning Commission recommended that the requirement for on-site management shall be provided 24 hours a day to be removed and replaced with a threshold of 16 units before on-site management is required, and the provision of an on-site or off-site management office for developments smaller than that threshold. The ordinance reflects this recommendation. Next slide, please. The Oxnard City Code presently includes a parking requirement for group quarters of 1 off-street parking space for every 4 farm workers and 1 parking space for every 4 facility employees, up to 4 maximum. The group quarter parking requirement was not identified in the housing element as a required amendment or required by the state to update. Accordingly, the zoning text amendment did not propose an update to this existing code requirement. The parking requirement was only included as a placeholder within the table for other required parking amendments. Based on public input submitted prior to the Planning Commission hearing, the Planning Commission deliberated and recommended that the parking requirement for group quarter style facilities be reduced to 1 space for every 6 farm workers. Following the Planning Commission hearing, staff reviewed the group quarter parking requirement for other jurisdictions such as Ventura County and Los Angeles County and found that the city's existing requirement of 1 parking space for every 4 farm workers is similar to or lower than other communities. We do not have enough information at this time to determine if the existing group quarter parking requirement in Oxnard has resulted in underparked or overparked housing. While staff was originally not proposing to make changes to this standard, the proposed change could further reduce constraints to the development of group quarter farm worker housing. Therefore, the ordinance reflects the Planning Commission's recommendation. And the next slide. So as mentioned earlier, the proposed single-room occupancy development standards are intended to reduce development costs to accommodate this type of development. The draft code included a single-room occupancy parking requirement of 1 off-street parking space per unit and 1 easily accessible long-term bicycle storage space per 2 units, or 1 off-street parking space per 2 units and 1 easily accessible long-term parking space per unit. So a choice of either one. A public comment submitted before the Planning Commission hearing identified a concern with the parking requirement and requested a ratio of no more than 1 off-street parking space for every 3 units and 1 bicycle space per unit. The Planning Commission deliberated and recommended that the vehicle parking requirement for single-room occupancy be eliminated and required only 1 long-term bicycle storage space per unit. Based on comparison of other communities, including Ventura County and the cities of Ventura, Santa Paula, Goleta, Santa Barbara, a requirement of 1 long-term parking storage space per unit and no off-street parking would be considerably lower than other communities. Also, if a single-room occupancy is located in an area where transit is not available, some parking would still be necessary to avoid an impact to the surrounding neighborhood. While most of the city is within 1/2 mile walking distance of public transit, staff recommends ensuring that in the few areas where public transit is not easily accessible, that minimal parking still be provided. Therefore, staff is recommending 1 change to the Planning Commission's recommendation. Staff recommends retaining a minimum single-room occupancy vehicle parking requirement of 1 off-street parking space per 2 units, with the exception provided if the single-room occupancy is located within 1/2 mile walking distance of public transit, including transit stations and bus stops. 1 manager's space and bicycle parking would still be required under the exception. The vehicle parking exception is similar to language in the city's accessory dwelling unit ordinance. The ordinance reflects staff's revised recommendation. The proposed amendment is consistent with several goals and policies included in the 2030 General Plan and will implement the code amendments identified in Programs 6, 9, 22, 27, and 32 of the amended adopted 2021 to 2024 housing element. A General Plan consistency matrix is provided within the staff report. And next slide, I'll now turn the mic back over to Joe Pearson for the rest of this presentation.
Thank you, Heather. Pursuant to the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, The proposed action is exempt from environmental review. The proposed amendments are regulatory actions that are necessary to bring the city's zoning code into compliance with state housing laws and the city's 2021 to 2029 housing element that was adopted in 2022. As discussed in the attached initial study, the proposed amendments do not propose or approve any physical development at new residential sites or units, or increase the density for housing beyond those analyzed in the housing element ISM&D. Furthermore, any development following approval of the zoning amendments will be subject to applicable environmental review requirements for that development. Therefore, staff has determined that there's no possibility that the project will have a significant effect on the environment. A notice of exemption will be filed upon City Council approval. There are no fiscal impacts to the city associated with the proposed zone text amendments to bring the Oxnard City Code into compliance with state housing law. At this time, staff recommends that the City Council conduct a public hearing, find the project to be categorically exempt from environmental review pursuant to California Environmental Quality Act guidelines 15061B3, known as the general rule, introduce the following 7 ordinances for first reading. An ordinance amending accessory dwelling unit parking and impact fee requirements in Oxnard City Code section 16-468 and 16-622, and an ordinance amending the city's density bonus ordinance in Oxnard City Code section 16-410, and an ordinance amending the emergency shelter standards in the City of Oxnard Code section 16-504 and 16-622. And continuing to introduce the ordinances, it's an ordinance streamlining ordinance provisions, clarifying permitting requirements, simplifying code requirements, and amending requirements on farm worker housing, supportive housing, low barrier navigation center, single room occupancy, and residential care facilities in Oxnard City Code sections 16-10, 16-20 to 16-144, section 16-148, 16-300, 16-303, 16-333, 16-441, and 16-622. And an ordinance amending reasonable accommodation requirements in Oxnard City Code section 16-501.5, and an ordinance streamlining, clarifying, and simplifying permit procedures for development design review, special use permit expiration, and major and minor modifications to special use permits in Oxnard City Code sections 16-525, 16-553, and 16-560. And lastly, an ordinance amending the attached dwelling unit standards in Oxnard City Code section 16-360.